Welcome back. Now in the last video, we ran up against the practical limitations of how much information you can cram into a single pivot chart before it starts to become unwieldy and hard to interpret. When we tried to plot multiple measures and multiple categories, there was quite a bit more going on in our little chart than our poor users could be expected to make any sense of. But dashboards are all about cramming lots of meaningful information into a small space, as long as that information can be easily understood and interpreted by our audience. So using this case as just one example, is there any way we can get all of this information in one chart while also making sure we don't give our end users a migraine? Well, it turns out there is, and that's by using a slicer to dynamically change the measure we display in the pivot. Now, since we're only plotting one measure at a time, we're free to break that measure out into multiple series, as we're doing here by category. So if you look at our measure slicer here at the bottom right now we've selected our line item sold measure, but then I can choose profit, and now our chart changes to reflect how profit changes over time, but also broken out by our 3 product categories. And of course, I can also choose revenue. And in each case, the axis of our chart dynamically changes to reflect the different scale of the measure we chose. Now, doing this takes a little bit of setup, as you might imagine, but the results are well worth it. So let's take a shot at building this from scratch. So our first step is to create a table that has a list of all the different measures that we're interested in toggling between. Now, an easy way to do this is to create the table directly in Power Query. So let's go to Power Query by going to Data, Get Data, and then Launch Power Query Editor. And while we certainly would have the option of creating our table in Excel and then importing it into Power Query, for a simple table like this, we can actually create the table right in Power Query without involving an external data source. So to do that, at the top right, we'll click this Enter Data button. And now we can manually enter a name for our column, values to go in that column, and also the name of our table. So first we'll call our table Slicer Table. And then for our column name, we'll enter Measure. And then for the values in our column, we'll simply type out the 3 measures that we're interested in toggling among, which will be line items sold, profit, and revenue. So at this point, I think we've got everything we need for our table, so we'll click OK. And now you can see that our table has been added to the list of queries on the left. So our last step in Power Query is just to choose Close and Load, and then Close and Load To. And then, as usual, we'll only create connection and make sure our table is loaded to the data model, and then click OK. And then scrolling to the bottom of our list of queries and connections, we see our slicer table is right there and available. So now you may be wondering where this new table we've created fits into our data model. So let's find out. Let's go to Power Pivot, Manage, and then go to our diagram view and zoom out just a bit. And now we see our slicer table all the way over by itself on the right, not connected to any other tables. But this is actually totally okay. We actually don't need to form relationships between this and any other tables in our model, which makes sense since there are really no natural relationships to form. Our slicer table is what's known as a disconnected table, a table with no relationship to any other tables in the data model, and it's totally fine when creating a table to be used as the basis for a slicer. So the next step then is to actually create a slicer based on this table. So we'll close out of our data model, and then with our pivot chart selected, we'll insert a slicer, and then scroll down until we find our slicer table. And then we'll just choose the measure field from that. And we'll change our orientation of our slicer to be 3 columns, and then widen it out just a bit and just a bit more, and then make it a bit shorter so we can stack it underneath our 2 slicers we already have. And we'll widen it out just a bit more. There we go. Okay, so now that we have our slicer table and our slicer in place, next we need to create a measure to capture or harvest the user's selected value from this slicer. To do this, we'll need just a little bit of DAX that we haven't seen before. Now first, we need to make sure that the user has only selected one measure. Obviously, we can't return 2 measures at one time in a given cell of our pivot table or a given data point in our pivot chart. So we have to make sure our measure accounts for the possibility that our user might accidentally select more than one item. So let's go ahead and go to our Power Pivot tab and then Measures, and now we'll create a new measure that we'll assign to our slicer table, and we'll call our measure Selected Measure. And now that first step is going to be to test whether the user's selection consists of one value or multiple values. So we'll say if, and now we'll use a new DAX function we haven't seen before, has one value, and this function takes just a single column, which in our case is obviously going to be the measure column from our slicer table. So this has one value function is going to return true if there is a single value from that column in the pivot table or pivot chart's current filter context. So if a user has selected just one item in our slicer, this has one value function will return true for that column. So in that case, we just want to return that value from the measure column of our slicer table. But remember the no naked columns rule from DAX. We can't just return the field. We need to wrap it in a function. And then only once we know it will return a single value. The whole idea is that a measure should only return a single value for any given set of coordinates in a pivot table or pivot chart. So the function we'll use to wrap the value from that measure column is the values function. So we'll type values, and again, just feed that our measure column. And now, if our user did select multiple items in the slicer, and our has one value function returned false, we'll simply return a blank. And now we'll check formula, and it looks like our measure is working, so then we'll click OK. So now that we have our measure that knows what the user selected in the slicer, we can use that to create another measure that returns a different measure value based on the user's selection. So to do that, we'll use our old friend, the switch function. So now I'll create another measure that I'll call dynamic measure, and I'll assign it to our slicer table. And now I'll use the more complex form of the switch function, whose first argument is simply the logical true. And from here, the rest of our function will simply be a series of conditions, and then values we want to return if those conditions are true. So now the first condition will be if the value of our selected measure, the measure we just created that harvests that selection from the slicer, is equal to line item sold. So we'll just type selected measure equals line item sold. If so, we want to return the value of the number of line items sold measure. So for that next argument, we'll just enter our number of line items sold measure. And then the rest of our switch function will follow this exact same format. We'll say if the selected measure is revenue, then return our revenue measure. And then if our selected measure is profit, return the profit measure. And then finally, if none of those selections were true, which shouldn't happen, but we should always include a default case, we'll just return blank. So now we'll check formula, and it looks like there aren't any errors, and then we'll click OK. And now it's time to put our new dynamic measure to the test. So I'll select our chart, and then remove number of line items and profit from our values area. But then I'll add our dynamic measure from our slicer table. Now right away you may think something went catastrophically wrong because our whole chart just went blank. But if you look at our measure slicer, you see that we've by default committed the no-no of having multiple items selected. But if I select just one of these, aha! Our chart reappears and is now plotting just that measure along our 3 product categories. And then if I select a different measure, we get a different chart, but in the same location and with the ability to toggle among all of these different measures with a single click. Pretty darn cool. Now at this point, between our slicer captions and our legend, we really no longer need a chart title. It also is basically chart junk at this point, so I can go ahead and delete that. And now there's one last little bit of refactoring we can do, this on the DAX side. So you may have noticed that we created an intermediate measure called selected measure to support the dynamic measure that we're using in our pivot chart. Sounds like a pretty good candidate to refactor out with a variable. So let's first go back into our measures, and then I'll find our selected measure and edit it to grab that code. And then I'll go into our dynamic measure, and declare a variable up top, and I'll call it selected measure. And I'll simply set it equal to the code that produced our selected measure. And then I'll add a return keyword. And finally, I'll replace all these references to our selected measure with this variable instead. So I'll copy that, and then get rid of our first reference and replace it, and then our second one, and finally our third one. And then we'll check our formula once again. Looks good. And just to be safe, let's click through our different measures in our slicer. And it looks like our slicer still works fine. And now the final test will be to go ahead and get rid of that intermediate measure altogether. So we'll find our selected measure, delete it. And now it looks like our dynamic pivot chart is still working. Okay. So while, as we've seen, pivot charts are pretty darn powerful and pretty darn cool, they also have their limitations relative to standard Excel charts. We'll explore some ways to get around those, while retaining all the goodies of DAX and the data model in the next video. I'll see you then.